They sat in silence, unable to speak or understand a word. But through lessons in English, these German women, POWs, found voices they never thought possible. Could learning to read and write behind barbed wire have changed their lives forever? Stay with us as we reveal the untold story of how words changed lives behind the fences. Captured voices, lost in silence. The moment the war ended, thousands of German women found themselves confined behind high fences, their world suddenly reduced to barbed wire and barracks. These were not soldiers, but civilians, young women, mothers, and workers who had lived their lives in towns and villages in quiet routines now shattered by defeat. They had heard gunfire, seen soldiers march, and felt the tremor of bombs, but nothing prepared them for the strange, unfamiliar world of an American POW camp. The language of their captors was a mystery, a barrier as tall and sharp as the fences that enclosed them. Each command sounded like an undecipherable code. Every shouted word was a door they could not open. Silence became both a shield and a cage. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of damp wood and old straw. Women huddled together in corners, whispering in German, careful to preserve some sense of identity amid uncertainty. They had been stripped of uniforms, ranks, and familiarity. Their possessions were few: a thin blanket, a tin cup, the clothes they stood in. Fear hovered over them like a cloud, but so did exhaustion. Some had walked for miles under armed escort. Others had been separated from family members in the chaos of surrender. No one knew what awaited them next, and the language barrier made every step feel perilous. The Americans who guarded them were distant figures. Some barked instructions, others moved silently along the fences. Eyes met across the courtyard with curiosity and caution. The women learned quickly that misunderstanding could have consequences, yet understanding seemed impossible. Signs and gestures were their only bridge, and even that often failed. A command to line up for roll call could spark panic if a woman misinterpreted a gesture. A whispered explanation from a fellow prisoner might be their only solace. Meals were rationed and predictable, yet even eating was complicated. A bowl of soup, a slab of bread. How could one ask for more without words? Questions went unanswered. Hunger was tangible, but the deeper hunger for comprehension gnawed at them more. What were the Americans saying? Why were some treated differently? Was kindness genuine or tactical? Their thoughts were a jumble of worry, memory, and speculation. Some women found small ways to communicate. A nod, a hand gesture, a shared glance became a language of survival. One woman, clutching a torn coat, tried to point at the sun to indicate morning, and the guard smiled, recognizing her attempt. Simple exchanges became tiny victories, proof that understanding was possible. Yet frustration mounted quickly. Simple needs, simple questions, and simple requests were often lost in translation. Words felt like invisible threads they could not grasp. The women also began noticing patterns: meal times, roll calls, the arrival of mail. They could anticipate events even if they could not comprehend the announcements. It was a strange combination of freedom within confinement. They began to invent their own signs and symbols. A tap on the floor could mean wait. A tilt of the head could mean follow me. Slowly, even without language, routines emerged. Survival required not only endurance but inventiveness. Yet amid the monotony and struggle, some felt a flicker of curiosity. Questions formed silently. Why are they teaching us rules but not words? Could it be possible to understand this strange new world? For women who had been taught to be obedient, the notion of learning rather than obeying was foreign. The first seeds of transformation had not yet grown, but they were planted in moments of quiet observation and cautious experimentation. By night, the barracks were filled with whispered worries and fragmented dreams. Some imagined returning home, others worried they never would. Silence became both a comfort and a weight. They could speak to each other in German, but not to the world beyond the fences. Their voices, once confident in the marketplaces or family homes, felt stifled. The question of how to reclaim them loomed in the stillness. How could words, so simple yet so distant, become a bridge between captor and captive? Could understanding emerge from fear, and trust from hesitation. The first steps toward an impossible connection were about to begin. Stay with us to uncover the details. First lessons behind fences. The morning sun cut through the fog over the camp, revealing long rows of barracks and the network of fences that seemed to cage more than bodies. They caged voices, memories, and dreams. Inside one of the larger halls, a chalkboard had been set up, and the first lessons in English were about to begin. For the German women, the sight of writing on a black slate was strange, almost magical. Letters that once meant nothing now waited to reveal their hidden power. The classroom was makeshift. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of nervous bodies. Some women perched on the edges, as though afraid the moment might shatter. Civilian volunteers and American soldiers moved between them, chalk in hand, pointing to letters and words, speaking slowly, repeating sounds over and over. The women tried to mimic them, their tongues twisting around unfamiliar syllables. Each sound felt awkward, foreign, and yet electrifying. The first hurdle was understanding that letters formed words, and words formed meaning. A hush fell over the room as a volunteer wrote the word bread on the board. She pronounced it slowly, then gestured to the loaf sitting on the table. The women exchanged hesitant glances, some suppressing giggles at the strange noise their mouths made. One young woman, barely 18, traced the letters with her finger, repeating the sound over and over, a rhythm that grew more confident with each repetition. It was as though the chalkboard itself had become a portal to another world, one where comprehension could exist beyond fear and suspicion. Suspicion, however, lingered. Why were these Americans teaching them to read? Was it propaganda, a ploy, or some form of manipulation? Some women crossed their arms, refusing to participate. Others peered cautiously from the back rows, hesitant to draw attention. The atmosphere was fragile, a delicate balance of curiosity and mistrust. Yet even the most reluctant students could not ignore the allure of words that unlocked meaning. Slowly, letter by letter, sound by sound, the first barriers began to crumble. The lessons were not easy. Mistakes were frequent, and embarrassment often followed. A single mispronounced word could trigger laughter from peers, sometimes nervous, sometimes genuine. But laughter became a bridge, a shared experience that softened the sharp edges of the unfamiliar. Confidence grew in small increments. Women who had once felt voiceless began to form words, haltingly at first, but with determination that surprised even themselves. Outside the classroom, the world of the camp continued with its routines, roll calls, work assignments, and the endless chores of captivity. Yet the lessons created a space separate from this monotony, a rare moment when prisoners were invited to engage rather than obey. The classroom became a place of quiet rebellion, where the simple act of learning transformed the experience of confinement. It was here that the women first discovered that power could exist in understanding, in the ability to decipher meaning rather than simply respond to orders. One woman found herself staring at a simple sentence written on the board: "The sun is warm." It was a line so ordinary, so plain, and yet it carried a thrill she had not expected. Words could describe her world, not just limit her movements within it. She practiced the sentence over and over, tracing each letter with her fingers, whispering it to herself during breaks, savoring the sound of comprehension creeping into her mind. As days passed, the lessons became more structured. The women were grouped according to ability, and repetition became their rhythm. Some learned faster, their eyes lighting up when they finally recognized a word on a sign outside the classroom. Others progressed more slowly, but perseverance began to chip away at frustration. The walls of the camp seemed to shrink in importance, replaced by the vast, uncharted territory of language waiting to be explored. By the end of the first week, the women understood that the classroom offered something more than letters and syllables. It offered agency, a subtle sense of autonomy in a world where nearly every action had been dictated by others. The first seeds of transformation were sprouting, delicate yet powerful. In these small moments, the captives realized that silence could be broken, that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides. Would a few simple words truly change the way they saw themselves or the world beyond the fences? The answer would unfold, letter by letter, lesson by lesson. Come with us to find out more. Suspicion of kindness. Even as the women sat at the benches and traced letters on the chalkboard, a shadow of doubt lingered over every lesson. They had been taught to obey, to follow orders, and to trust the familiar rules of their homeland. Now their supposed enemies were offering lessons, patience, and attention. It felt almost unreal. Why would Americans, who had fought against them, take the time to teach German women to read? Could there be a hidden motive behind this unexpected kindness? In the beginning, most women kept their distance. They whispered in German among themselves, comparing notes and exchanging warnings. Every smile from a teacher, every encouraging nod, was scrutinized. Some suspected propaganda or an effort to manipulate them. One woman refused to open her notebook, convinced that learning English was a trap. She watched the volunteers carefully, measuring every word, every gesture, and every glance. Others approached with tentative curiosity. They wanted to understand, but understanding felt dangerous. The classroom became a stage for small acts of courage. A woman with trembling hands raised her pen to write a word. Her heart pounded as she copied the letters from the board. She knew mistakes would come, yet she persevered. When she finally whispered the word correctly, a soft nod from her teacher made her stomach flutter. Pride and suspicion clashed within her. Could she trust this approval, or was it another test? Observation became a critical skill. The women watched how the Americans interacted with each other and with other prisoners. Gestures, tone of voice, and repetition were clues to intentions. Slowly, some began to sense genuine effort behind the lessons. One volunteer bent down to help a struggling student form the letter R. There was patience in her eyes, a kind of calm that did not demand obedience. It was the first time many of the women had seen compassion without expectation. Even with trust beginning to grow, fear lingered. Some women made deliberate mistakes in class, testing boundaries and measuring reactions. Others quietly copied words from the blackboard when the teacher was not looking, stealing moments of knowledge while guarding their independence. Learning had become a private rebellion, a way to claim agency in a world that had stripped them of choice. The process was not without frustration. Letters were hard to form. Sounds refused to come correctly from their mouths, and sentences stumbled from their pens. At times, women cried quietly in the corner, feeling humiliated at having to start from the beginning at an age when reading had once been simple. Yet every small victory built confidence. Words, once foreign, became stepping stones toward understanding not only a new language, but a new way of interacting with the world around them. Outside the classroom, the camp continued in its rigid routines, indifferent to these private triumphs. Work details, roll calls, and chores went on as usual, yet the women carried a quiet determination. They had begun to glimpse that knowledge could be a form of freedom. The act of learning was small, almost imperceptible, but it was theirs. It belonged to no one else and could not be taken away. Some of the women began forming secret study groups. They whispered words to each other at night, practiced sounds in the barracks, and copied lessons onto scraps of paper. Sharing knowledge became a form of resistance, a way to assert control over an environment designed to limit them. What began as suspicion slowly evolved into cautious engagement. Words started to feel like tools rather than traps, and the first threads of trust began to weave through the camp. By the close of this phase in their lives, the women found themselves standing at the edge of change. Fear still lingered, yet curiosity had begun to grow, softening walls once thought unbreakable. They were discovering more than words on a page. They were discovering the courage to trust and the possibility of connection in a place once seen as only hostile. Could a few acts of patience and kindness really break through years of fear and mistrust? Would the women ever speak freely without hesitation in a language that once seemed impossible? Let us take you through the secrets. Hunger for more than food. Rations in the camp were simple and measured, but for many women the real hunger was not for bread or soup. It was for understanding. Each lesson in English had awakened a craving far beyond the needs of the stomach. Words, sentences, and letters became a new kind of nourishment, one that fed curiosity, hope, and the fragile spark of independence. Early in the mornings, women would line up for their meals, glancing at the chalkboard or the notebooks they had hidden beneath their beds. Some would trace letters in the condensation on the windows, practicing silently while waiting for the chow line. Each word they mastered felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming a world that had been taken from them. Understanding signs, instructions, and even the simplest labels gave them a taste of freedom inside the fence. The hunger for knowledge grew alongside other forms of longing. A woman who had spent years managing a household found herself captivated by newspapers handed out by the Americans. She stared at the headlines, attempting to recognize familiar letters and words. Each syllable she deciphered brought a thrill unlike anything she had felt since childhood. Reading became a private triumph, a quiet declaration that she could survive and even thrive in a place that had once seemed alien. Books, pamphlets, and scraps of printed material began circulating in the barracks. Some women discovered medical labels and instructions on packages, while others focused on letters and simple stories. The act of decoding words provided more than information. It gave a sense of mastery over their environment. They began to understand the world around them in a way that extended beyond commands and routines. Each line read was a step toward independence. Even simple notes became treasures. A short message from a friend or a newly learned English phrase scribbled in a notebook became a symbol of achievement. Women compared words, corrected each other, and celebrated small milestones. Sharing these victories was as nourishing as any meal, strengthening bonds and creating a sense of community. Learning together became a quiet form of solidarity, a way to claim dignity in a place designed to limit it. The physical environment also began to take on new meaning. Labels on cans, signs on doors, and instructions for work details became objects of fascination. Every new word unlocked another piece of the camp's secret life. A woman could suddenly understand when she was expected to clean a barrack or when a delivery of supplies had arrived. Language became a tool, a lens that transformed previously confusing routines into comprehensible patterns. Hunger for literacy sometimes collided with fatigue. Work details and chores left the women physically exhausted, but many returned to their notebooks in the evenings, tracing letters with tired fingers, whispering phrases aloud. Sleep often came late as they wrestled with sounds that did not exist in German and words that resisted memorization. The effort was taxing, yet deeply rewarding. Each syllable learned was a small rebellion against helplessness and a claim to their own agency. The emotional intensity of learning was profound. Pride swelled in their chests when they finally read a sentence without hesitation. Frustration occasionally erupted in tears, but even mistakes became evidence of progress. Every error revealed what they did not yet know and hinted at what was possible. Their hunger was not just for survival, but for understanding, for engagement with the world outside themselves, and for the ability to participate rather than simply obey. As time passed, the camp began to change in ways that were not immediately visible. The shifts were not in its fences or barracks, but in the thoughts and emotions of the women inside. What they realized was that survival did not rest solely on food, medicine, or warmth. A different kind of sustenance emerged: literacy, offering freedom, connection, and the first steps toward self-expression. Even within the confines of captivity, they discovered a form of strength that could not be rationed, confiscated, or silenced. The ability to read and write became a hidden power, shaping their spirits in unexpected ways. Might the power of reading and writing reshape their entire captivity? Could this thirst for knowledge grow into something far greater, shaping the women in ways they never thought possible? Stay with us to know. Writing home in a new tongue. The first pen in a German woman's hand was trembling. It was not just ink on paper. It was an attempt to create meaning where previously only confusion had reigned. Notes had been encouraged in the classroom as exercises, but for many women, the idea of writing in English was both thrilling and terrifying. Each stroke of the pen carried weight, each letter a small triumph against silence. Sheets of paper, once blank and meaningless, became gateways. A young woman copied words carefully from her notebook, forming sentences that sounded awkward yet unmistakably human. "I am well," she wrote slowly, testing the shapes of the letters as if they were foreign creatures she was learning to tame. She paused repeatedly, rereading each line, convinced she might have made a mistake. The pen scratched across the page, leaving a trail of nervous determination and discovery. Others were bolder. They attempted letters to family members far away, uncertain if the words would ever reach the intended eyes. One woman folded a piece of paper with painstaking care, writing a note she hoped her sister would understand. Even the simplest phrases, "I am safe," or "do not worry," required concentration and courage. Mistakes were frequent. Words were broken, sentences stammered, yet the meaning endured. Every note carried a sense of achievement, proof that language could transcend walls and fences. In the barracks, women compared their attempts in hushed voices. Spelling errors prompted giggles, yet they were accompanied by encouragement. "Try again," whispered a friend. "You are almost there." Sharing these small efforts became a quiet ritual. The women discovered that writing together made the burden lighter and the progress sweeter. Notes exchanged in secret held a magic all their own, offering reassurance and companionship amidst the uncertainties of captivity. Teachers began to encourage correspondence, providing guidance in grammar and pronunciation. A volunteer would guide a hand, gently correcting a misformed letter or miswritten word. These interventions were subtle, yet transformative. The act of having a teacher observe without reprimand created a sense of safety that many had never experienced. Writing became a form of empowerment, a tool through which women could assert agency in a place that had limited their autonomy in countless ways. Messages were not only for family. Women began to write to each other, creating short letters that captured daily routines, minor victories, or fleeting observations about the camp. One woman wrote about the arrival of new vegetables in the kitchen, another about a small act of kindness from a guard. Writing shifted from instruction to expression. Each sentence brought clarity and control, offering a way to document reality on their own terms rather than merely respond to commands. Even the smallest successes were celebrated. A note that was legible, a sentence that made sense, or a correctly formed paragraph became evidence of growth. Women began to set personal challenges. "I will write 10 sentences today," or "I will learn 5 new words and use them in a note." The act of writing, once intimidating, became a source of motivation. Their notebooks, once simple tools for copying letters, transformed into repositories of personal achievement and confidence. At night, some women lay in their bunks, whispering words from their notes to themselves, practicing pronunciation and spelling. Others read aloud to friends, carefully guiding each other through new phrases. The physical act of writing intertwined with speaking created a layered understanding, reinforcing lessons learned in class. Words became tangible objects of power, tangible in ink and sound, capable of carrying ideas and emotions far beyond their immediate surroundings. A few women began to experiment with storytelling. Simple sentences describing camp life or small memories from home were written in English, forming narratives that were fragile yet undeniable. Each story, imperfect as it might be, held the promise of self-expression, a way to assert identity in a world that often reduced them to numbers or chores. Writing became both a practice and a revelation, a method to shape reality instead of merely reacting to it. As the days passed, writing in English became more than an exercise. It became a lifeline. Notes, letters, and stories allowed the women to communicate, reflect, and connect. The power of the pen transformed fear into curiosity and hesitation into deliberate action. The women discovered that sentences, however broken, could carry intention, emotion, and information, connecting them to the outside world and to each other. Are these hesitant notes the beginning of freedom, a language strong enough to cross the barbed wire? Will the women discover that words can travel further than their bodies ever could? Come along as we uncover the hidden story. Teachers who became bridges. In the camp, it was an idea many German women had never encountered. The Americans who had begun teaching them English were not just figures of command but guides across an unfamiliar world. Slowly, the women noticed gestures of patience and attention that transcended the barriers of language and past enmity. These teachers became bridges between two worlds that had once seemed impossible to connect. In the early days, lessons were focused on letters, words, and pronunciation. Yet some volunteers took extra steps, moving beyond the rigid curriculum. They used gestures, drawings, and objects to illustrate meanings. A simple apple could demonstrate the word fruit, while a broom could stand in for clean. The women began to rely not only on their notebooks, but on these silent cues, learning that comprehension could exist without perfect translation. Each interaction was a small negotiation, a careful testing of limits and intentions. Patience became a recurring theme. When a woman mispronounced a word, the teacher repeated it calmly, modeling sounds slowly and clearly. There were no reprimands, no raised voices. Instead, the women observed tone, inflection, and facial expressions, absorbing subtle lessons in communication beyond the classroom. A hand extended to help correct a letter became a gesture laden with reassurance. For women who had been conditioned to obedience under threat, this style of teaching was startling, even disorienting, yet it opened new doors. Conversations began to develop, halting and fragmented at first. Simple questions like, "How are you?" or "Do you understand?" were exchanged. Responses were slow and cautious, but they revealed an unexpected possibility. Communication was possible, even with a language barrier. Smiles, nods, and repeated attempts built trust in a way that words alone could not. Women discovered that learning together involved not only books and chalkboards, but also observation, patience, and mutual effort. Some Americans shared small stories about daily life, illustrating words with gestures and props. A volunteer mimed a walk to the market while teaching the word shop. Another described cooking in exaggerated motions, letting women connect action with vocabulary. These moments were filled with laughter and delight. Women began to mimic movements, practicing phrases aloud. The classroom transformed into a theater of learning, where understanding emerged from performance and observation as much as instruction. Trust developed slowly. The women tested boundaries, sometimes avoiding the lessons or pretending not to understand. Volunteers responded consistently with patience, never forcing participation but encouraging engagement through gentle guidance. Over time, this consistency became a bridge itself, connecting suspicion with curiosity. Women who had been cautious and mistrustful began to attempt more complex words, ask questions, and explore the language without fear of judgment. Even beyond lessons, Americans engaged in small acts of assistance. They helped with chores, offered extra supplies when possible, or paused to explain procedures in simple words. These gestures reinforced the lessons in the classroom, showing that learning English was not merely a performance, but a pathway to interaction and understanding. The women began to perceive their teachers as allies rather than overseers. Writing exercises became collaborative. A woman struggling with a sentence received help not through command, but through demonstration. The volunteer would write the word slowly, pointing to each letter, then allow the student to copy it at her own pace. Corrections were gentle, encouraging, and never punitive. The sense of empowerment that accompanied successful sentences grew with every interaction. Women learned not just English, but a method of learning built on respect, patience, and shared effort. Friendships started to emerge within the classroom. Women helped each other practice, repeating words in hushed tones, correcting mistakes, and celebrating small victories. Teachers guided these interactions without interference, letting bonds form naturally. Language became a conduit for connection not only with the Americans but also among the women themselves, knitting together communities within the camp. By combining guidance with encouragement, the teachers shaped a new kind of relationship, one based not on fear or obligation, but on understanding and mutual effort. Each lesson in English became a lesson in empathy, trust, and collaboration. The women began to see that bridges could be built even in the most unlikely places, where barriers of culture, language, and conflict once seemed insurmountable. Would these fragile bridges hold strong enough to carry them beyond the fences and into a world where choice, understanding, and trust could truly exist? Let us tell you. Shame, pride, and the struggle within. The first strokes of English on paper felt like walking on unsteady ground. For the German women in the camp, every letter traced and every word spoken carried both frustration and resolve. Struggling with sentences reminded them how far they had fallen from certainty, yet also revealed how much strength remained to be gained. In the barracks, women practiced quietly, covering their lips as they whispered English words to themselves. Simple phrases that a child could speak easily became exercises in patience and humility. Some cried softly when their hands failed to form letters correctly, or when they stumbled over sounds that seemed impossible to produce. Shame was pervasive, a constant companion that mingled with exhaustion from work details and endless chores. Yet amid this struggle, pride emerged. Every correctly formed word or sentence was a victory. A woman who managed to write, "I am learning," felt a surge of confidence, her chest lifting with achievement. She looked at her notebook not as a reminder of her limitations, but as a record of progress. Other women noticed, whispering encouragement and sharing tips. Pride grew in the communal effort, as small successes became shared triumphs. Mistakes, though frequent, were transformed into learning opportunities. A mispronounced word could spark laughter among peers, sometimes gentle, sometimes teasing, yet it created a space for camaraderie. Women corrected each other softly, repeating sounds, guiding hands, and tracing letters side by side. Each act of support strengthened not only language skills but bonds among prisoners who had shared fear, hunger, and uncertainty. The struggle was more than intellectual. It was emotional, touching identities shaped by decades of life in Germany. To be reduced to learning the alphabet in a foreign tongue felt humiliating. Pride in one's past knowledge collided with the necessity to start anew. Some women resisted, refusing to participate at first, clinging to familiar routines and silence. Others persevered, discovering that growth required confronting discomfort and embracing vulnerability. Even daily activities became intertwined with the struggle. A simple task, like labeling a basket of laundry, became an exercise in translation. Women rehearsed words aloud before attempting them in class, correcting themselves repeatedly. The camp, once a space defined by order and limitation, began to transform into a classroom of resilience. Each letter written and each word spoken was an act of courage, a refusal to be diminished by circumstance. Peer support became critical. In the evenings, women formed small study circles, reading aloud, practicing spelling, and correcting each other. Whispers in German mixed with English phrases, creating a rhythm of learning that carried into the night. They shared frustrations and celebrated small milestones together. The collective effort made the challenge bearable, turning shame into determination and struggle into growth. Teachers continued to guide with patience. When a student stumbled, they repeated the sounds, offered gentle corrections, and sometimes demonstrated gestures to clarify meaning. No one was ridiculed. No one was left behind. These moments reinforced that learning could coexist with dignity, that failure was part of the process, and that every small achievement mattered. The transformation was subtle, but real. Women began to speak aloud with more confidence, write longer sentences, and engage with the language beyond mere survival needs. What had started as a painful, humiliating exercise evolved into a source of pride, a symbol that they could reclaim a part of themselves even in captivity. Confidence was fragile but growing, a force that would carry them through the next stages of literacy and self-expression. Evenings in the barracks were filled with whispered practice, quiet laughter, and tentative storytelling. Mistakes still came, but they were accompanied by determination and shared encouragement. Shame no longer paralyzed them. Pride and accomplishment began to outweigh fear. The struggle within became a catalyst for growth, preparing them for the more creative and expressive uses of language that awaited. Does mastering a new language turn shame into strength? Will pride grow with every word and sentence they claim as their own? Stay here as we reveal everything. From students to storytellers. Within the camp's makeshift classroom, something unexpected was unfolding. What began as halting drills of letters and simple phrases was slowly becoming a path toward expression. No longer limited to repetition, the women were learning to shape thoughts of their own. With pens in hand and notebooks open, each lesson turned into a quiet act of self-discovery. Small notebooks, once used for copying words, were now filled with observations. One woman wrote about the arrival of fresh bread. Another described the first snow she had seen in captivity. Simple details, ordinary yet precious, became narratives of experience. The act of writing turned daily routines into stories worth telling, transforming the monotony of camp life into a tapestry of personal reflection. Some women experimented with poetry. Lines were imperfect, sentences fractured, yet the rhythm and sentiment were unmistakable. A phrase about the cold barracks or a smile from a fellow prisoner carried weight far beyond its simplicity. Writing became a way to process emotions, to translate fear, longing, and curiosity into tangible words. Each entry was a quiet declaration of identity and resilience. Letters evolved beyond exercises. Women wrote to family members describing their days and small triumphs in English. Words that had once felt intimidating now carried meaning, connection, and hope. The process of composing sentences, carefully choosing each word, allowed them to reclaim agency. Through storytelling, they were no longer merely surviving. They were documenting, interpreting, and sharing their experiences. Reading aloud became a communal activity. Women gathered in small groups, taking turns narrating their entries. Mistakes remained, but laughter and encouragement accompanied them. Sharing stories strengthened bonds among prisoners, creating a network of mutual support. Storytelling became both a social and educational act, reinforcing language skills while deepening trust and collaboration. Teachers continued to guide, offering feedback, explaining meanings, and encouraging creativity. They acted as mentors rather than authority figures. Gestures, demonstrations, and repeated explanations became tools to help the women articulate thoughts more clearly. The classroom now felt less like instruction and more like a laboratory for imagination, a place where experimentation was celebrated. By writing and reading their own narratives, the women discovered a sense of freedom within captivity. Words became portable bridges, connecting them to the outside world, to memories of home, and to each other. Each story, note, or poem was a step toward autonomy, a way to define themselves beyond the fences and regulations of camp life. Would women once silenced by fear find their voices in storytelling? Could their written words open a world where expression was finally free? Come with us to know what really happened. Freedom beyond the fences. For the German women, release from the camp was more than a return to the outside world. It was the moment when the words they had painstakingly learned, practiced, and written became a tangible part of themselves. Notebooks, once fragile and private, now traveled with them as symbols of resilience and transformation. Some women paused at the gates, clutching their notebooks, tracing letters with fingers that had learned patience and perseverance. English words they had once stumbled over in whispers were now familiar companions. Each phrase represented hours of concentration, small victories, and emotional breakthroughs. They had learned not only to read and write, but to express, to connect, and to reclaim autonomy that captivity had sought to diminish. Communication became immediate and profound. At first, it was basic: greetings, simple questions, expressions of gratitude. Yet even these small interactions carried the weight of accomplishment. They spoke to volunteers who had guided them, now seeing the fruits of lessons once met with suspicion. Smiles exchanged across fences became shared recognition that human connection could survive conflict, patience, and learning. The women also reached out to family and friends, writing letters in English that documented their experiences. Each carefully formed sentence carried both information and emotion. The words bridged worlds, the camp and home, fear and understanding, silence and speech. They were able to share stories of hardship, hope, and resilience that transcended the limitations of captivity. Some women continued to write creatively, composing reflections, short stories, or poems. Literacy had become a lifeline, a means of self-expression that could never be taken away. Language, once foreign and intimidating, was now a tool for freedom. The notebooks, filled with imperfect sentences and heartfelt observations, became treasures that preserved their journey from silence to voice. As the women dispersed, returning to villages, towns, and families, the skills they had acquired followed them. English words opened doors, fostered new connections, and offered opportunities beyond survival. The transformation began in a classroom, behind fences, and through patient guidance, but its effects rippled outward into the wider world. Release did not erase memory. The camp remained a backdrop to their stories, but it was now colored by achievement, discovery, and empowerment. The act of learning, writing, and sharing had turned captivity into a stage for growth. What had begun as fear, suspicion, and hesitation had become curiosity, expression, and pride. What do you think about this extraordinary story of German women POWs finding their voices through English? Share your thoughts in the comments below.